In today's video, we're going to be assembling the RR502 standalone conveyor. You're going to need a couple of tools right off the bat: a 10 and 13 millimeter wrench, a 16 and 17 millimeter wrench, a 7/8 wrench, and a small mallet or hammer. So the first piece required for assembly is going to be the main frame section, and then the rear axle housing assembly will be bolted on to the back. Once the axle frame section is inserted into the main frame section, you will tighten the 4 bolts at the back and the 2 bolts underneath to lock the 2 pieces together. The front frame section will be attached to the main frame just by sliding the 2 pieces together and then tightening the 2 bolts that will lock them together. The jack mounts will be installed on the front of the frame. Go ahead and tighten all 8 bolts, locking those jack mounts onto the frame. We can install the axle swivel pieces, and they will be installed with a bolt that should be snugged up so that the free play is taken out, but not so tight that you can't actually swivel the wheels. Next up, we're going to install the wheel and tire assemblies onto the axle. Once the wheel and tire assembly is placed over the axle, you can then install the washer and then the castellated nut, and then you will tighten up that nut so that it is snug but not too tight so that it prevents the tire from turning on its own. And once that is installed, then you can put in the final cotter pin to lock the nut in place, and the dust cap will go on over top of that. Repeat for the other side. The jacks can be installed over the brackets we installed earlier and locked in place with a little pin. Locate the orange cross frame and then line it up with the rear frame of the machine and install it with the provided bolts. So now the hydraulic reservoir can be mounted on the main frame of the machine, so you'll want to remove the bolts already on that piece of the frame and then install the reservoir and tighten down the bolts to lock it in place. With the reservoir now installed, the engine is ready to be installed right next to it, and you'll just remove the 4 bolts that are already there, install the engine, and tighten the bolts down to lock it into place. The 2 frame braces will be installed between the rear axle assembly and the main frame assembly. Use the bolts that come in the brackets and tighten them up once they're in place. Now the hydraulic lifting cylinder will be installed on the back frame and then attached to the cross frame. If needed, you can actually extend the cylinder by hand to make it line up to the bracket. Once the cylinder is installed, you're going to lower the assembly by hand. Next piece to be installed is the muffler protection bracket. Head to the front of the machine, raise up the jack, and then insert the front drawbar into the frame tube. Partially assemble part of the trough on the ground before it gets installed onto the machine. So for installing the trough, you're going to want to start with the bottom piece of the trough, which has the rubber roller, and then the center section, which you can see bolts up to the front section with the flat flanges. Go ahead and completely tighten these bolts up. Now that the 2 sections of trough have been connected, you can pick them up with the help of another person and set it on the machine with the front roller lining up right near the jack. To attach the front of the trough to the machine, you will grab 2 pins that will slide through the bearing assemblies and lock the trough to the bracket where the jacks are mounted. Go ahead and tighten the nuts on those pins to lock the front of the trough to the frame of the machine. Now the third and final piece of trough can be installed. As you see in the video, it's being installed in line with the rest of the trough. The easier way to do it would be to flip that final piece of trough up and over so it lays right on top of the middle piece, and then the weight of it is held by the rest of the trough. It makes it much easier to line up the bolts. So now you can go ahead and snug up those bolts, not so tight that the trough won't move when you try and fold it, but tight enough that the free play is taken up. Secure the latches on the underside of the trough. The control valve tower will be installed onto the main frame and secured with a T-bolt, and then the valve will be installed onto the tower. The control valve handles can be installed onto the control valve. The hydraulic drive motor will be installed at the front of the machine, and the shaft on that motor will actually insert into a collar that is on the side of the rubber roller. And then you will install the motor onto the frame with the 2 bolts provided and snug up the Allen bolts that lock the sleeve onto the shaft of the motor and the shaft of the roller. Now we will be installing all of the hydraulic lines on the machine at the various locations. This is just an overview of the system once it is finished. The first 2 hoses to be installed will actually be the longest 2 hoses on the machine, so locate the 2 longest hoses and place them near the front hydraulic motor. Install the 90-degree end of the hose onto the hydraulic motor and install the straight end onto the middle top port on the control valve. Install the second hose on the hydraulic motor and install the straight end at the middle lower port on the control valve. Install the shortest hose from the pump to the reservoir. Next up, we're going to install the hose from the pump up to the top right port on the control valve. Now we're going to run the hose from the lower middle port on the control valve up to the upper port on the cylinder. The second to last hose will be installed on the control valve in the top middle port over to the lower port on the lifting cylinder, and the remaining hose will go from the left port on the valve to the reservoir. The top roller will be installed with the flat side facing the bottom or the floor, and then the 10mm nut and bolt will be installed snugly but not too tight that you cannot slide the roller backwards and forwards. The belt can be unrolled and pulled across the top and the bottom of the trough. You can pull the 2 ends of the belt together, install the pin in between the lace, and then bend the ends of the pin up so they aren't dragging against the trough as the belt moves. The 3 pieces that make up the hopper can now be installed at the front of the conveyor. The 2 pieces that make up the top extension will be installed. The last steps are to fill up the hydraulic fluid reservoir, the fuel tank on the engine, and to put oil into the engine.